Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Last week, we recapped the whirlwind of New York's Spring Art Fair week, but the action didn't stop there. The following week brought the major New York Spring Auctions, an equally important event on the art world calendar. These sales offer an important window into pricing and collector behavior. Not only do they give us a sense of where the market stands, but they're increasingly becoming a more viable buying channel for collectors who may have previously avoided auctions altogether. In this week's episode, we take a closer look at how the May auctions performed and what they reveal about the current state of the art market, as we're joined by Zachary Small and Tim Schneider, both of whom provided excellent coverage of the sales in the New York Times. Zachary is a culture reporter covering art for the Times, and Tim is the founder of The Gray Market, and he's also a freelance writer. Together, we break down the results, discuss evolving buyer behavior, and examine what all this might mean as we head into the second half of the year. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Zachary and Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Excited to break it down with you.
Well, we're really excited to chat with you and help us break down everything that happened over the past week. And it's really been an exhausting couple of weeks with so much going on in New York. First the fairs and now the auctions. And you had so many great articles in the New York Times covering these events. So we appreciate you taking some of your time to chat with us. So I think a great place to start would be to take a look at the overall results from these auctions and understand both how they compared to recent years, as well as to the market's expectations going into the week in light of the slowing art market that we're experiencing.
Yes. So in a single word answer to both of those questions, bad and bad. We've seen declining sales in the art market overall over about the last 2-3 years. That's remained consistent in the auction world as well. And coming into this auction season, I think both Tim and I, and probably you, heard this term, we're seeing a flight to quality, like enough of this crazy speculation. We're going for the Warhols and the Giacomettis. The auction came around, the Warhol and the Giacometti were, either failed to sell or were withdrawn. It just didn't pan out the way that people at the major auction houses hoped. They took big risks, and oftentimes it was a swing and a miss.
Yeah, and I think that going along with that too, it felt even a little bit worse because of the fact that we have been told now for going on 2 years, I feel like, that everyone sort of needs to tamp down their expectations. Estimates are going to get more conservative. They're going to come back down to earth. We're going to get back in touch with reality and what the market really wants. But that by now we were supposed to kind of have been, I don't want to say at the bottom necessarily, but that things were supposed to have kind of plateaued. And it didn't really actually kind of pan out that way. All the major houses at the end of the day underperformed their collective low estimates. If you looked across the evening and day sales and you strip out all the fees that, of course, we all know add like 20% or so roughly onto whatever people are actually submitting as a final bid. So it didn't particularly live up to expectations, I think it's safe to say. And I don't think a lot of people feel great going into the summer based on that.
Yeah, and I think if you actually look at the art that was for sale this season, you could argue maybe the material wasn't as strong as in past seasons. But to me, one of the big takeaways is this shift in buyer behavior. Collectors, they appear more selective, and not just about which artists they're pursuing, but even the quality of the examples by those artists that they are pursuing. How do you interpret this change, and what do you think are some of the major driving forces behind it?
Well, I feel like you have a really good handle on this too, Adam. So I would maybe be interested to hear from you first. What's your buyer behavior? What are you hearing from other people too?
Yeah, happy to share my thoughts. I think the shift in buyer behavior is largely tied to the changing perceptions around the investment potential of art right now. And that's not to say that most people are buying art purely for investment purposes. I'd actually argue that number is actually quite low, but when you're spending five, six, or seven figures or even more on a single artwork, the question of value and future potential inevitably becomes part of the equation. And I think at the moment, the belief that all of these artists will increase in value over time has really dwindled. And I think previously a lot of the art being made, it seemed like a viable and good investment. I mean, in many cases, shows were selling out many times over. Auction prices for many artists were much higher than primary prices. I mean, I think one of the first real signs of weakening came as a result of the Chinese real estate market softening. And we also saw the Chinese government applying pressure on collectors and wealthy individuals there not to take their money out of the country. And we suddenly saw, as a result, less buying from them, in particular at auction. And this led to a softening in the auction results for many artists, in particular more speculative artists who tend to be on the younger side. I think another important category of collectors that really shifted their behavior is a faction of collectors who are directly impacted by the changes to the US tariff policies. Maybe they own or work for businesses that rely heavily on imports and exports. I know a few of these collectors, and I think the increased tariffs and even just the uncertainty regarding changing tariff policies has impacted their businesses so directly that a lot of these individuals just aren't going to be spending a lot of their discretionary income on art right now with that kind of looming uncertainty to their businesses. And then I think you have a large group of collectors, honestly, who have just acquired a lot of art over the last several years coming out of COVID. You know, some acquiring 50, 100 works a year. And some of these collectors just over the past year have only bought a dozen or sometimes just a few. And that has a significant impact on the galleries they were buying from, the artists that they've been buying from, pricing at auction. You know, they have a lot of art in storage, and there just isn't that same drive to continue to collect at that same pace when it doesn't feel like many of the artists will continue to rise in value from the current pricings. So these are some of the thoughts in my head, at least, when it comes to reasons behind some of the changes in buyer behavior. But of course, there are several others out there as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that that shows up in the results from auction week as well. I mean, one of the things that Zach and I looked at was this sort of, frankly, semi-anemic performance from what I would consider to be sort of, broadly speaking, post-war American great painters. And I feel like within that flight to quality narrative, there has been a sort of blanket belief that like everybody whose name you know from the 50s and 60s and 70s in the US who's in a museum is like an equally good store of value at the very least. And that has not proven to be the case. I mean, to me, one of the big lots, even setting aside the Warhol, which I'll let Zachary riff on because I feel like this is one work that they're particularly like really keyed in on. But there was this big gray Frank Stella painting that Sotheby's had that was one of the higher end lots in its contemporary evening sale. It was supposed to go for 10 to $15 million, and it hammered at 6.5. So I mean, good news, it sold, but not so good news. It was way below. And for something that came in and was supposed to like really help anchor that sale, it's ended up being this sort of cautionary tale of a sort in terms of, well, maybe the demand for these things that are acknowledged as great is not what it used to be. And we can debate again, like how much of that is the economy, how much of that is shifting taste among younger collectors. But the reality is that at the end of the day, the juice wasn't there.
I would add on to that, as much as we're looking at buyer behavior, I think buyer behavior in some ways is very easy to track. You're right. Like these are very wealthy people, and many of them do collect art because they love art, but a lot of them still think about the financial implications, their own liquidity. If there's economic uncertainty, stuff doesn't move as quickly or at as high prices. It's also a dwindling, it seems, at least it indicates there's a dwindling amount of people that are willing to spend, above $20 million for a painting, right? I think the larger and maybe more interesting story is just like how this business has been built over the last generation. I think that the auction houses have both been in a race to the top and a race to the bottom at the same time. And that's kind of left them with the floor falling out from underneath them. So as much as they've raced for these really, really big numbers and seen that there's less and less people able to get there, they've seen basically the entire market for Asia disappear over the last 3 years. They've also made it a lot easier to participate in bidding. You can send your advisor's advisor to bid for you in the room. You don't have any connection to this anymore, right? It does become more of a financial product when you're not actually going in the room, really spending time with the work. And I think, the amount of activity we see in the day sales is much more exciting for, crusty old journalists like us to watch because you see what the auctions used to be like, where you see, people really bidding. Today in the evening sale, they try and define depth of bidding as four bidders. I don't think anyone in the real world would say four people is like a deep amount of competition, right? So I think and Tim and I have talked about this a little bit before, is like there on the bright side of things, there's a great opportunity to be a disruptor in this space and to change how people are interacting with art and the business of art.
I think those are great points that both of you raised. And one other thing I'll add is I feel like moments like these can also present actually really compelling buying opportunities. You just have to know how to spot them, whether it's at auction, privately, or even through a gallery. And it can be quite difficult for many to spend significant money on art in times of uncertainty. But if you do have strong conviction about the artist and the quality of the work, it could turn out to be a great acquisition. I mean, in my experience, I think truly exceptional works, they don't come to market often. And when they do, they're usually the ones that appreciate the most over time. And so you may have some of these opportunities that come up simply due to the level of uncertainty in the market or certain economic factors that are influencing individuals and forcing or prompting them to sell things they otherwise wouldn't be selling.
Yeah, I would say that the only thing that complicates that calculation is that it really seems like tastes are changing. So not only are you looking for the good deal, but a good deal today on someone like Warhol might not be a good deal in retrospect a couple of years in the future. As Tim mentioned before, we've looked at the Warhol market for a long, long time now, and major works by him are really rare in evening sales today. And when they come up like Big Electric Chair this season, for like $30 million, it gets withdrawn because of lack of interest. So I think it's a little more complicated where you're also betting on the future of the market at a time when the quality supply for these big blue chip artists has really dwindled because it's either held up in museums or the people that wanted it no longer want it.
So most of the market, of course, doesn't operate at the top end, but trophy lots, they still really capture the market's attention. They get a lot of press coverage. I know you covered these top trophy lots extensively in the New York Times and did a great job doing so. How much did these top tier works underperform this season, and what's the backstory behind a few of them you felt were really interesting to report on?
The top lot discussion, I feel like, has really become this double-edged sword for the auction houses and for perceptions of the market overall. Obviously, there's always a huge competition between Christie's and Sotheby's primarily. I mean, Phillips trying to get a few punches in there when it can. But there is this competition every year to try to get the biggest collection, the most expensive lot with the highest estimate. And we, of course, have these huge marketing buildups in the weeks leading into the auctions that are really centered around these supposedly great once in a lifetime trophy works. And that's all fine. But the flip side to it is that if those works don't perform well, then of course they get an outsized amount of attention on the back end too. And this was a season where that really ended up being the case. I mean, the work that had the single highest estimate of the week, which was the Giacometti bust at Sotheby's, failed very publicly. didn't have a guarantee going in, and the bidding wasn't there when the lot actually opened, and it blew a $70 million hole effectively into the takeaway from Sotheby's plans that night. And then Zachary already mentioned the Warhol part of it, and then there was I'm trying to think what the Mondrian at the Riggio sale at Christie's, which sold, which was great, but that was estimated to go for in excess of $50 million. There was a lot of talk about how it was potentially going to set a record for Mondrian, and then it sold on a single bid, presumably to the guarantor, and it actually just kind of didn't get where it was supposed to go again. So if you just look at those three lots in and of themselves, it takes out like a major portion of what was supposed to be, both from a monetary standpoint, the real foundation of the week, or like the kind of the crown of the week, for lack of a better term, and the excitement of it too. It's just like it's never going to make the people in the market feel good when the big stories of the week are things at the very top that had all this attention on them, just frankly didn't get where they were supposed to go.
One of the brighter spots of the auction week was the really strong performance by several female artists, really across different price points and even stages of their careers. Who are a few that stood out to you, and do you think a gender-based price gap might still persist, or why do you think some of these female artists may have performed so well this season?
So I think that your point is really savvy, Adam. To me, it's not just the takeaway that women in general sold on average, I think, better than expected relative to comparable male artists this season. It was really women from across the spectrum of age, of kind of career stage, of ethnicity, of all these different types of things. You can go into any sort of slice of that market and find multiple examples, I think, of women artists who did really, really well. I mean, if you look at younger artists, there were two Danielle McKinney lots, which went for, I believe, over $200,000. And that was against estimates of $50,000 to $70,000 each. There was a record price for Emma McIntyre in one of the evening sales. You go older, you have, for instance, Olga de Amaral, who's 93 years old, and she had a record set at Phillips for work that went for all in around $1.2 million. And then a couple days later in a day sale, another work almost beat that. So you can just kind of keep going into it, like Grace Vardigan, Kiki Kogelnick, Simone Leigh, like all these different women from, again, different time periods, different backgrounds, different styles, all this kind of stuff. And one of the few points of consensus that I felt like we had from buyers this season was that these artists, these works were much more competitively priced, or much where there was much more value to be gotten out of them by going after them. And that's why you saw not only the results that you did, but the results after really, really active bidding. I mean, this was it's not a week where there was a ton of really heated competition for things, but if there's one slice of what was available where you saw it repeatedly, it tended to be for these works by women artists.
What I would add to that as well, I think there were some misplaced predictions ahead of the auctions that we would see people, a flight, another flight, but this flight away from women artists or artists of color, given some sort of tilt in the culture, following Trump's election. I don't think that ever really made a lot of economic sense in terms of the art market. And I think, that my thesis there was maybe proven a little bit correct this season. What's happened, as we mentioned before, a lot of these blue chip artists, there's limited quality supply and there's dwindling demand. So the market, if you're really smart and you're a smart collector, you're looking who is going to be the next Warhol, who's going to be the next Franz Klein, even at that price level. And it makes a lot of sense to be saying, hey, there are all these artists who are objectively amazing that have never had a place in this market before. Why don't we make that place now at a time when nothing else is doing really well? So, I think as much as we try and lay on politics to this, we have a lot of really savvy economic operators who are looking at this as a supply and demand issue and trying to solve for that.
Yeah, more than anything else, it's an example of how economics trumps politics. Not to use a pun there. I'm sorry about that. But yes, and I think that also, just to kind of round out this discussion, to go back to the whole flight to quality thing, I think that ultimately what you saw in this case was not so much a flight to quality per se, but a flight to value. It was this idea of here's a segment of the market where we feel like we can still get really good prices for things that are still going to appreciate in the future, as opposed to something that we could compete for that maybe would hold its value or go up a little bit over time, but ultimately not really make the kind of investment sense that some of these other opportunities would.
So I also wanted to ask you about auction guarantees. It's a little bit inside baseball, but it's of course a very important part of auctions, and we discuss it sometimes on the podcast, but we're not always covering it. But guarantees are, as I said, always really a key part of auctions, and I think it's interesting in this climate to see their importance for auction houses and for the market, with more work selling to a single bid or going unsold than was the case a few years ago. How different is the role of guarantees in building a sale in this type of market compared to maybe a few years ago?
Yeah, so you're correct to note that the rise of guarantees over the last, 3, 4, 5 years has been noticeable. And for people that don't know, right, a guarantee is when the auction house secures a sale, right? They're saying either they themselves will buy the artwork from the consignor for a minimum value, or a third party buyer comes in and says, I'll take it for a minimum value. So it's a safety measure, but it's not really, in my opinion, and I think to the definition and spirit of what an auction is, part of a true auction where you have, a willing seller and willing buyers, and there's competition. It signals oftentimes a lack of competition. And what we saw that was really interesting from a reporting perspective this season was that the way that the auction houses were talking about the guarantees had really changed. So, in previous years, they'd be like, yeah, we got some guarantees. Like, we just want to be really safe on that one. And now they're like, this is a sign of success. We sold something. We got it through the door. That is very different than saying you sold something well. So it sounds based on our conversations with executives at auction houses that this kind of system is here to stay. But I think it does still raise questions of like, what is our definition of an auction in 2025?
Yeah, I always think about there was one time a few years ago where I heard Alan Schwartzman speaking on a panel after he had left Sotheby's, so he was letting it fly a little bit more than usual, maybe. But he talked about how when it came to guarantees and the way that they affected bidding in the room, in a lot of cases, what you had was that the auction was happening before the auction, which was to say that people were competing to try to figure out who was going to be able to finance the thing in the first place. And that was where you really saw the competition between people who maybe a generation ago would have actually been in the room trying to win the work and generating a much more kind of exciting thrill ride of an event. So I think that that's you can't assume that that's always the case, but I think that it is a factor and it does impact this kind of fundamental way in which the auctions themselves have shifted in terms of how they feel in the room.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was speaking to a collector a few months ago before these auctions occurred when the catalogs were really being built up, and they were considering selling an excellent painting, and an auction house they were engaged with was offering them a guarantee. And speaking to them, their mindset really was, well, if I accept this guarantee, I think it's most likely going to sell for this guarantee amount. So basically, I have to make the decision, do I want to sell this work for that amount or not? And they viewed any bidding beyond that guarantee as really icing on the cake, but they really weren't expecting that. And I don't know, maybe that's a different mindset than a few years ago when people would accept the guarantee, but still thought there was a significant chance that it might sell for much more than that.
Slightly, I would say slightly. And I think that this is part of the race to the bottom that we've noticed. So, The reason why I say slightly is because you can look back to 2022, when I believe it was Sotheby's that sold the record Mondrian in 2022 for $51 million. And let me just pause to say, it's very sad to me that I know all of this by heart at this point. I've lost all my knowledge of fun things, and now I just remember numbers and squares. But that record I reported at the time was based on a guarantee. And so we tend to start forgetting that history as we get farther from it. But it's like, okay, so the Mondrian that we have this big record that was supposed to be a sign of like really good times was still based on a guarantee, and essentially, nobody really bid on it. So what does that mean when we come back to this Mondrian that could have been a record that also, you know, only went to one person who bid on it, and it was below this previous guaranteed record? I think you start seeing just how thin a lot of these markets are. And like, I'm sure all three of us here in this conversation would love to own a Mondrian. But are you going to pay 50 million for that is another question. How many people are willing to, this is like the core of, I think, the issue at the auctions lately.
Of course, the art market is considered quite opaque, and these auctions really do provide rare moments of full transparency or close to full transparency. They offer insights on pricing of different artist markets. People maybe are recalibrating pricing. It reveals a lot. So coming out of these sales, how do you think the market is feeling as we head into Art Basel next month in June and the second half of the year? Do you think the market is feeling any differently than it did heading into these auctions?
My sense is that your feelings really depend on who you are. I think that trying to talk in any really broad-based way about how expectations have matched up with reality is an increasingly tough thing to do. I think that the market right now is very complicated, and Zach has heard me say this a few times over the course of the past few weeks. But I think that there's enough competing information that you can basically try to stand up any story that you want to tell about it. So if you're more inclined to be optimistic, or it helps your case from a business standpoint to try to point out the pockets of strength in the market, you can do that. If you want to take a more pessimistic view of things, there's certainly plenty of evidence to allow you to do that too. So I think that really when we come to the summer, I feel like it's really a matter of how much people believe that there was really a good reason to expect some kind of grand turnaround from this auction season. Most people that I know and trust sort of felt like, well, we're not really expecting this thing to blow the doors off of like our expectations. We're probably going to come out of this and be pretty much where we were before. And I think that that's generally the case. The one caveat that I would put on that is that if in cases where, say, you're a dealer who's operating with pretty thin margins otherwise, and things are still in the same place that they've been for several months and arguably a couple of years now, that does wear on you. And it does start to get to a point where even though things are just uneven as opposed to being a complete catastrophe, it gets to a point where a change in degree eventually becomes a change in kind, and something that you could muddle your way through for a year or so suddenly starts to look a lot more dire.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, some of the funny text messages that I got after the auctions when I checked in with my sources, one major art advisor said, "The patient shows signs of life," to which I responded, "Does that mean they almost died?" People, it's an emotion-based market with not a lot of people participating in the market compared to, I don't know, buying and selling gold. So I think in some ways, the art market is always sort of on their tippy toes. Uh, and as Tim said, that means that you can look at this and say the glass is half empty or half full. At the New York Times, I think we've really been strengthening up our quantitative skills, and you'll see more of that from us in the near future, hopefully. But I think as long as, we're relying on our quantitative skills and, of course, all the qualitative stuff that we're always doing and talking to so many people around the industry, it becomes clear that this is a real come to Jesus moment for the market. And that if people don't start making, radical changes to how they're doing the business, they're going to see it crumble, especially as they're trying to find new buyers and new generations to come in. It's just not happening in the system that they have it today, which means that the size of the pie is going to get smaller, and the really big dogs are going to eat well, but everyone else is going for the chum bucket, I guess. So again, that in a way, that's my positive view of things, which is that it's a great time to uh, be someone to change things up, and I think it's a hard time if you want to play it safe, oddly enough. So that's what I'm kind of excited for to see in the next couple of months is like, who's the person willing to take a risk?
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting second half of the year, and we'll certainly be covering everything closely. Zachary and Tim, thank you so much again for coming onto the podcast and sharing some insights from your excellent coverage of the auction week in the New York Times. If our listeners haven't checked out all of your reporting there yet, they definitely should. And moving forward, where can we follow you on social media and also find your continuing coverage of the art market and art world?
Google us. You'll
You
find
can,
us.
yeah, I mean, I'll shill for myself as a small business owner here. The Gray Market, you can subscribe at thegraymarket.substack.com. You can find me on Instagram at _gray market. That's gray with an A. I am not British. I don't spell it with an E, though some people I have not met in person still think that I am British.
And if you say my name 3 times in a dark room, I'll show up. So it's easy to find.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you both coming on, and yeah, I hope you get a little bit of rest after a crazy few weeks, and looking forward to seeing you in Basel in June.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam.